Well, it's 1 o'clock. If you want to keep me, I'm afraid it's going to be $45 an hour.
Nah, that's okay. I'll walk home.
Yeah, why spoil a perfect evening?
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace the creative evolution of the series and count down, finding the exact moment in which it began its inevitable decline. I'm your host, Erix Antoine, and this week I'm once again joined by my good friend Joshua Fein. We'll be discussing The Way We Was, which originally aired in the US on January 31st, 1991. This episode flashes back to 1974 to tell the story of how Homer and Marge first met as high school seniors. And after some initial awkwardness from an, of course, bumbling Homer, as well as a series of typical rom-com conflict, they eventually fell in love. It's a sweet, character-driven episode, very much in the spirit of a classic romantic comedy film, not unlike the one parodied by the title, or yes, the celebrated work of James L. Brooks, who almost certainly had a firm guiding hand behind this episode. Josh Fein and I always seem to discuss these Smiles to Tears episodes for some reason. That's all well and good, as there are plenty of things to talk about and explore. So without further ado, here we go. So welcome back, Josh. How you doing?
Well, as I say to others, for everything that's going on, under the circumstances, I have no right to complain. That's all I could say about that. So how have you been, Erix?
Fine, and I think I completely agree with you. I understand where you're coming from, the whole idea that, you can't complain. I've got my health, I'm keeping safe. There are people who unfortunately do not have that, so who am I to bitch about, oh, I don't get to go to bars anymore, or whatever.
I know what you mean. I mean, is it annoying that you have to, be cooped up, for lack of a better word? Yes. You got to keep, and does it excuse it? Not really, but you got to still keep it in perspective. And for me, I'm still working. A lot of people are not, and I have to keep that in mind when I'm sometimes mildly annoyed at stuff at best. But
Right.
we're not here talking about the current events of the day. We're here to
No.
talk about this wonderful Simpsons episode.
Yeah, the way we was.
Way we was.
We're here to talk about the way we was. It's a significant episode for many reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The first being that it's I guess it's the first official origin story.
Yes.
I think the first, it's not the last. They kind of go back to this well several times throughout the series, but it's the first one that really, it's the first one that sort of does a little bit of a backstory, does a whole flashback thing, and it's very significant. I think it really speaks to who the people that made this series at the time, who the writers were, who the showrunners were. You really see that in this particular episode, I think, very clearly, because it's the origin of the Simpsons, and in a sense, clearly the writers are drawing from their own perspective, their own experience, and that's a key thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is as you said, it's the first flashback episode. It's the first episode that has John Lovitz, and of course, we'll be seeing more of him throughout the series. It's the first time we hear the sarcastic Charles Bronson sounding guy.
That's right. Yes, the quote unquote Charles Bronson. I think they refer to him as wise guy. I think that's
sarcastic
sort of
guy. I think it is.
Yeah,
or so,
because yeah, he shows up because that character essentially here he's a limo driver, but eventually he's like all kinds of things. He just shows up in tons of episodes.
Very sales clerks. I remember him famously as the ADR voice of hey, fatty, I got a movie for you, A Fridge Too Far.
I believe it's Hank Azaria who does
this. Yes, it
is. And it was essentially just, I don't even know if that was, as I understand it, usually the way these episodes are produced is that first they do the recording. At least they do an initial kind of pass where they do a recording of the script. And then they animate based on that, obviously. And so it clearly, when they saw that he just, I guess Azaria just was inspired and said, you know what, for the limo driver, I'm just going to do a Charles Bronson, impersonation. And so he went and did that. And so they actually made the limo driver kind of look like Charles Bronson. I'm pretty sure that came from that. I doubt that in the script it said, and the limo driver looks and sounds like Charles Bronson.
That's right. I don't think they went that far. I think that was certainly the magic of his area doing that. We also had the very brief appearance of Marge's father, who I think is the first and last time we see him. Basically looking like Chief Wiggum with Patty and Selma's face pasted on him.
Yeah.
We never see him again. I think
that's not entirely true. No, we do see him, but I think it's several seasons down the line when it's revealed that he was a flight attendant, or am I getting that confused with something else?
No. I remember this. I know what you're talking about because it was the Marge's Fear of Flying episode, and
right.
I think it was discovered that he was a flight attendant.
Yes.
But he looked nothing like how he does in this episode. And
then, it's a totally different character.
And there was some random anecdote that she had. It was where the swear jar came up, and she mentions that her father used to swear a blue streak and nearly lost his job as a baby photographer, which is the plot of the Rodney Dangerfield hit Easy Money.
Yes.
But I don't know if that was intentional or not. But it's all the nebulous biography of the parents of the Simpsons. As you can see, there's no one set continuity. I wanted to discuss this episode for a couple of particular reasons. In the past, you had talked about in another episode the idea of seeing your parents and trying to envision your parents as young. It's like that Big Chill effect.
Yeah.
And, this is an example of that. We see Homer and Marge as high school students. I saw this episode when it first aired back in 1991. We were in the throes of Desert Storm because this was in late January 1991. My folks, they graduated high school in the early 70s in New York, so they were in college in 1974. It's just, again, that idea. It's hard to grasp as a kid, the idea of what your parents were like before you came along. And that always stood out to me, because they were obviously, they were different people, before you're born, and then you just know them as you know them as a kid and as an adult. And that always stood out to me. And then the other thing that always stood out to me with this episode is that this is a flashback to 1974. And this is airing in 1991. So it's 17 years in the past. And so I'm sure you saw that meme some time ago. Like they talked about that American Graffiti was filmed in 1973, but it was set in 1962. So if we set a movie 11 years past, and I think this was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been 2005 or 2006. And it's hard to grasp that if you had a flashback episode like this, it would be set in 2003, 2004. And we know that there's it's a distinctive gap between what we see in 1991 and 1974. And when you think about, that's a huge amount of time, 17 years, but things didn't necessarily look all that much different, as opposed to where you had distinctive decades and distinctive periods all throughout like the latter half of the 20th century, I would say.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and it's not something that I thought about at all. And you're completely right. It just didn't occur to me at that moment that the flashback, it's flashing back to less than 20 years in the past, because Marge and Homer, they're in their mid-30s. They're younger than I am, and so they're remembering their high school years, their high school senior year. And yeah, exactly. And that is a very interesting point where even though it was just 17 years, the difference in aesthetic, the difference in just, and it's not like they're exaggerating. That's true. That's how it was. You look at the 90s, you look at the 70s. It's a very different thing. It really feels different in every way. The aesthetic, the pop aesthetic of it, the music, everything is completely different. And then you go even a decade later, even 10 years later, even 1984 is completely different from 1974. And then you go from 1984 to 1991, and it's completely different. And you're only talking about 7 years. It's not a huge thing. And now here, as we sit here talking, it is 2020, okay? And in our heads, let's go back to, as you just said, 2003. Is it different? Maybe it is. I don't know. Like, how different is it really?
It's much more subtle. See, this has always stood out to me. There was an internet writer that you and I used to know. I'm not going to mention the guy's name.
Sure.
That I remember this from his review of the Final Destination, which at the end of the Final Destination, you find out it's a prequel for the first Final Destination movie. So the Final Destination takes place in 2000. Okay. And the writer was talking about, this movie, except for the cell phones, I would have thought this movie looked today. And basically the article ended up him whining about how it used to be such significant change every 10 years. And I thought about that, and I thought that was ridiculous. And then there was another comment relatively recently. I was just happened to be online, and someone had said, even though like it may seem that not much has changed going even back 17 years, society has changed, but the aesthetics may not have changed. And that's even an over-exaggeration, because there's definitely little subtle changes. Like, especially if you're in your, like, as a teenager or your early 20s in the early 2000s, you know full well what was popular then is not popular now. I'll give another example. There's this wonderful show on Hulu called Pen 15, and it takes place in the year 2000. And the conceit is that these two women are playing their teenage selves while the other kids around them are actually 13-year-olds. When you see it, you'll understand what I mean. And they have all these little subtle details that let you know that you're in a different time and place. And obviously, the first thing is technology. Maybe some of the clothes for women are a bit different. This stood out to me when I saw the Black Mirror episode for San Junipero, and they have a segment that takes place in 2002. And I graduated high school in 2002. Ooh, baby, do you know what that's worth? Because that's the other thing. It's when you get older, you realize your past is starting to get depicted in television and movies, and that's it's a sign of life. So you have to. It could feel a bit uncomfortable, and you're being aware of getting older, because, as you said, you're older than Homer and Marge in this episode. I'm older than Marge and Homer in this episode, because they're probably in their early to mid 30s.
They've established, I think Homer's 35 and Marge is, I believe, 34.
It starts out that way, and then I think it goes up to him being 38. And then the timeline seems to always move. But I remember the film City Slickers, where Billy Crystal is 38. He's got 3 kids.
39.
39, that's right.
Yes.
He's 39. Yes. He has 3 kids, a huge house, an extremely well-paying job. And this is when he has a midlife crisis.
Yes.
And I'm 3 years away from that, and I can't believe what I'm hearing.
I'm 39. I'm saying moo cow in a river. Do you believe this?
He's 39. He's younger than I am. I'm turning 43 next month. Okay, it's absurd. And then I start to analyze my own life, and I go like, I think midlife, it's a different thing. I mean, for boomers, it was one thing.
Yeah.
But now it's different. It's like generations change.
Generations change, and I think also what you're able to do. I think that boomer mentality was that you got that house in the suburbs, you had your kids, you had your wife or your spouse, and it's like I hit this arbitrary number, and it's like, well, I got to go get hair plugs and the Corvette, and the wife is gone for a younger wife. So, and that was always a thing. And the point I made about envisioning your parents young, again, the idea of seeing what your parents were like when they were young. And I mean, I have pictures, and but it's still just, you can't get into that headspace, because again, someone one way, you can't envision what they looked like prior to that. And I know for me, it's like almost like, I don't want to know. It's like, I know them as this person, and that's how they want to present themselves, and I'm just going to rely on that image. Like for my folks, my folks grew up in New York in the 60s and 70s. We all know how wild of a time that was. I always like to think what my parents must have been doing at this time, running around the outer boroughs of New York City in the early to mid 70s.
The whole concept of what were your parents like when they were kids, when they were your age, or when they were, what we think about as we're growing up. And obviously this is tapping into that. and Back to the Future taps into that. That's the whole concept of Back to the Future. It's like if I met my dad, if like he's a guy in high school, if I knew my dad in high school, would he have been my friend? Would I have even like wanted to hang out with him? Like like how would that have been? And that whole concept. And then of course it's the whole thing like what were they like? And here in The Simpsons, you're talking about seeing him with hair. I mean, obviously you have when Homer's a senior in high school, he's got a thick head of hair still, and he's already losing his hair, but he's not concerned at that point because, and that's truthful too.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I lost my hair fairly young, or started losing it fairly young, and so about my mid-20s is where I started to really notice it. But that stuff like happens beforehand. And I do remember like there was this one time, and I might have been about 18 at this time, and I got ready for a party, and I was getting ready for like a party, and I got all decked out. It was like a semi-costume party kind of thing. I wore a cool suit, and I slicked my hair back. I combed it back, which wasn't how I would normally wear my hair. I combed it back. I step out of the bathroom, and my uncle was there, and he was like, "Whoa, someone's gonna go bald real soon." Like it was just like a really mean thing to say to me. But yeah, he was evidently right. Within 5 years of that event, it began to become serious.
I can't be throwing stones in a glass house because I know now when I look back, I didn't think about it with my dad about what he was basically doing a comb over, and I'm not, I'm eventually going to slide into that myself, most likely, despite whatever I've got. I'm sure you're looking at me right now and thinking I'd kill for what this man has got. But
yes, pretty much, yes. So give me the receding hairline with the cool like widow's peak that comes down. I'll take that. I'll take that over nothing. You know what I mean?
You want the Phil Collins special? Is that what you want?
Well, no, that's but you've got way more going on than Phil Collins.
Yeah,
by this time, Phil Collins was just. There was nothing there.
Yeah.
He tried to make it work. He tried to make the mullet, the bald mullet. He really tried to make that work. But, other than that.
Right. I've heard that referred to as the skullet. I personally like to refer it to as the Frasier or the Michael Ironside. But starting with this episode, the episode, and I remember this when I first saw it, they start with a Siskel and Ebert parody. And, speaking of first, they also introduce McBain.
Yes, that's true. Rainier Wolfcastle.
As McBain. And then they had to retire McBain because there just so happened to be a movie called McBain. And I do remember this, I think, because it was in 91. Now, I've never seen the Christopher Walken McBain. I think I tried once, and I never finished it. I know it's nothing to write home about, but that stupid movie cost us the use of McBain for several seasons, and it was quite ridiculous. Yes. They eventually brought it back, but by that point, I stopped caring.
Yeah, well, interesting that you should point that out because it's true. And I have seen the Christopher Walken McBain. I've seen the movie, and here's the thing: if you didn't know, let's say like you didn't know the history, and by this point, why would you? It's been 30 years. So let's say you sit down and you watch that movie McBain. You would think that McBain in The Simpsons is a parody of it because McBain is a very stupid action movie. It's a stupid over-the-top action movie. The only difference, obviously, that Christopher Walken is not an Arnold Schwarzenegger type. But apart from that, in terms of how the movie is, it's a fucking dumb action movie.
What does it take to set a country free? McBain.
And so from the McBain segment, we go into a Siskel and Ebert parody, which was in vogue at the time. I remember when in Animaniacs, it would show up quite a bit.
It's a pretty on-point parody because it makes sense that if this were Siskel and Ebert, I think it's realistic that Ebert would end up loving McBain and Siskel would just despise it.
I didn't like the picture from the violence where you see a guy with a knife. I mean, it's so unpleasant.
Now, this is an intro, and it's an inspired intro because it has that gag and it has the whole Siskel and Ebert thing, and it's there to set up a framing story. But I'm going to say this: I think personally, watching it now, it seemed awkward to me. It just seemed like the sort of thing where they had an idea for a story, where they said, we want to explore how Homer and Marge got together when they were kids. We want to explore that. It might be a fun thing to do. But they said, but how do we do it? And instead of just doing that, instead of just making it an episode set in the past, which they easily could have done, but I guess they figured that maybe the audience wouldn't trust them, that they didn't set it up somehow. So they come up with this awkward framing device, which is like the TV breaks, so let's tell the kids a story. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't work for me. It feels really like, it just feels really shoehorned.
I would say that it's a typical TV sitcom framing device. The TV broke, the power went out, we're stuck in an elevator, we're trapped in this attic, and now we have an excuse to do a clip show, which they eventually do in The Simpsons anyway.
I guess it is a typical device, but as you said, it's usually used for, the eye roller, the classic eye roller, which is the clip show. I mean, it's usually for something like that. And in this case, that's not the case. It's an original episode. It's an original story. And I'm wondering why they use the framing device. Do you think it's because they had the story, but it wasn't long enough, and so they needed to pad it out, or that they figured that they needed to set it up? What do you think?
I think they need to set it up, because I don't think this episode is padded at all. In fact, if you notice from the intro's cut off. And then the end of the episode is immediate. Because as soon as you have the end of the episode, you have the end of the flashback, Homer and Marge, it cuts back to the present. They start kissing, and then Bart starts gagging.
Yeah, it's their way of going like, yeah, it's a sappy ending. We know it's sappy. We're going to put the button on that we know it's sappy, Yeah. But no, I totally get what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that the episode was padded. I was just wondering, because it doesn't feel padded. You're right, and it feels, and the story is pretty organic. But what feels off to me is the framing story. But I get that maybe they just didn't figure out any other way of doing that, any other way of telling that story. But since it's a well that they would return to, because this episode basically has a sequel next season, right? Essentially, there's a sequel to this episode, which talks about when Bart was born and all of that, the early days of their marriage. And I don't remember what the framing story is there. It's been a while since I've seen that episode.
I agree. I don't remember what the framing device was for that episode, actually, standing out. I do remember vividly with that episode. I think it opens with a Billy Joel song when they flash back to 1980.
No, it opens with Supertramp.
Ah, that's what it is.
With the Logical song. Well, I mean, we'll get to that when we'll get to that. I think for continuity purposes, it only makes sense for us to be talking about that one when the time comes. But I do think the mid-'70s period detail is definitely on point. That awesome fro on Dr. Hibbert, first of all, is tremendous. Although that's 1980 or whatever, but still. And then you flash back to 74, and the bell bottoms, the color, the types of colors. The soundtrack is great.
Oh, the soundtrack is enjoyable. I do enjoy how they get around with the Steve Miller Band, the Joker, because there's the lyrics of I'm going to probably screw it up, but it has the lyrics of he's a smoker, he's a joker, he's a smoker, he's a midnight toker. Yeah, the episode seems to get real convenient about leaving that part of the chorus out. But they are willing to mention the use of the word bong in the episode, which, of course, as a 7-year-old, I didn't understand. I thought the period detail was excellent. And what was also interesting is that they didn't lean too hard on cultural references. And, I mean, they talked about, like, the speed limit.
Right.
Like, you'd expect someone probably now making some comment about Nixon. You don't have any of that here. I actually paused and looked at the sub-headlines of Miss Magazine, and I was able to write down 3 of them. They include Why All Men Are Bad, 25 Reasons Not to Shave Your Armpits, and of course it has this, you can't identify who the person is, but it's just this generic pissed off looking woman on the cover, and that's what they have for Miss Magazine. And
this episode was not written by noted libertarian John Swartzwelder, so this kind of leans heavily in sympathy with the feminist movement and Marge. Even though it makes fun of it, it pokes fun at it. It's sympathetic to that. I don't think it.
Yeah, no one's making no one's making comments or anything like that. It's not making fun of it, I think, except for just that magazine. But you're not getting like into these diatribes about women's lib and all that stuff. It's just used as a device to get Marge into detention. And
right.
I love, I like the look of Marge in this episode. I think she's got kind of like an Ally McGraw thing going on. I think the episode overall is a great acting role for Julie Kavner, because you really don't get that range. I can't think of a lot of episodes with Marge where you get that range. She's playing younger. She's playing more assertive. It's not being the housewife. She's also, obviously playing a younger Patty and Selma and her mother. It's something that we don't get to see very often.
It's a very well-written episode with a lot of interesting, intriguing character details. When they show Homer and his dad, it's an unusual detail that I think at this point, the concept was that he was a widower. I don't think they developed it yet to the point where eventually we find out the truth about Homer's mother. But in the reality of this episode, I think the idea is that he's a widower.
I think it's implied. I think it's
basically implied, yeah.
That there's just no mom. And
there's no mom there.
There's just, it's never said if he's a widower, the mom left him. It's just never spoken. So you kind of infer that, that he must be a widower.
Right. And it's just something you assume. Right.
Yeah. It's a standard sitcom trope with a single dad with kids. It's like, okay, the wife must have passed at some point, so we'll go beyond that. And
right.
Although I will say Abe looks kind of weird he's drawn kind of odd. He very much looks like a buzzard or a vulture, almost Mr. Burns like. When they try to draw him a slightly younger, old version, he does look quite weird. Oh yeah, and he gives terrible advice too.
Horrendous advice. He's basically just he's essentially giving love advice based on that song that. Character of Artie Ziff, played by John Lovitz, who is Homer's romantic rival, inadvertently in any case, and the villain of the episode ultimately. It's an interesting character, though the thing, and it makes sense that somebody like Marge would ultimately select him as her prom date. But the part that to me seems odd is that the way that Artie Ziff is rendered is he's not rendered in a traditionally handsome way. Kind of a short, stumpy guy, with glasses and not particularly an impressive specimen of any kind. But when he shows up to pick up Marge, Patty and Selma are apparently smitten by him, like as if he were a catch.
Well, I guess because Homer had shown up prior, so it's like they hate Homer, so anything that's not Homer is immediately better.
I guess that's the point, yeah.
And then the look of Artie, I looked this up on Wikipedia. This was based on someone that David Silverman, the director, knew. And the look of all the students was based on who they had found in yearbooks of that time. And I guess for Artie, the look of him was also in the 70s. It was the time of the nebbish intellectual, where Elliot Gould could be considered a sex symbol, as we saw from that one student who would refuse to date Barney even if he was Elliot Gould. It was the norms of the masculine man being challenged for the sensitive man.
That's a good point too. I mean, when we look back on the 70s, what the sex symbols, what movie stars were in the 70s. And I mean, sure, you had traditional things. You had traditional guys like Warren Beatty or Robert Redford, who obviously they fit the traditional, leading man mold. But you also had, as you said, you had Elliot Gould, or you had like Gene Hackman or Woody Allen, for fuck's sake. I mean, these were movie stars that, had box office hits and let's keep going. Al Pacino, a wonderful actor. Don't get me wrong. I think we can all agree that. But again, certainly not a traditional. In fact, he's so untraditional that they didn't even want to cast him in The Godfather. I mean, I think it was Robert Evans who kept referring to him as the runt. You know what I mean? Because they wanted to cast Ryan O'Neal or whatever as Michael Corleone. So it is interesting. It points out that the let's say the image of traditional masculinity, let's say, was being challenged in the 70s by pop. And although there were traditional things, obviously, you had the teen heartthrobs like Scott Baio or
like David Cassidy is another
yeah,
one.
all of that. You had that. Obviously, you had that, and that was the traditional ideal. The pretty boys and so on.
Mhm.
But on the other end of the spectrum, you had Elliot Gould, and who could be a quote unquote sex symbol because he was intellectually stimulating in a different way. That's an interesting point. I think it's daring to have his heel turn, to have Artie Ziff's heel turn basically be an attempted rape.
Yep.
I think for a comedy show, for a sitcom to do that, I think is daring. It's shocking, unexpected, but it works for the story.
Artie, please.
Come on, kiss me.
Oh, Artie.
Please.
No, really, I mean it. Now stop it.
I'm sorry, Marge.
Take me home, Artie.
It's a surprising thing. I legitimately can't think of. I mean, that type of thing had happened in sitcoms before, but definitely not in animated form.
If something like this had appeared in a sitcom before, it usually was handled with seriousness, with complete seriousness. I believe there's an episode of All in the Family,
yes,
where Gloria is attacked, off screen, of course. But the point is that she shows up home and she's traumatized by what happened, that she was assaulted and there was an attempted rape. I believe they did another one also where Edith Bunker is also attacked. So it's something that they did, but anytime that it was handled, it tended to be handled in a way that was more serious. The only exception to this might be in Family Ties, when one of Stephen Keaton's co-workers makes some moves on Justine Bateman, and it's kind of gross, and Stephen Keaton's reaction is rather subdued.
Unfortunately, for such difficult subject matter, it gets easily mocked when it's portrayed in those very special episodes. I'm always partial to the infamous Tom Hanks as a drunk Family Ties episode.
Yes,
a classic.
It's a great episode, but again, a totally ineffectual Stephen Keaton, where he's present when Tom Hanks loses his temper, Uncle Ned, and like strikes Alex.
Leave me alone! What the hell are you doing?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
I think the moments that Homer and Marge have, when unfortunately deceives her initially when they're trying to study French. And this is the only time we ever see Marge, where we learn that Marge had studied French, and she's tutoring Homer. It's a lovely scene, and I don't know. I guess Homer not quite thinking through that. Like, yeah, let me tell her that this was all deceived, trying to deceive her and hopefully making out with her. This will go over well.
Yeah, he actually thought that would impress her. That he's honest, he could have kept that one to himself, because ultimately his deception was innocent, and he ultimately, the intentions were not. Yeah, of course he's hoping to make out with her, score with her, whatever, but he's not pushy about it.
No.
And and certainly he treats her with respect while she's there, and it works. His ploy works. She totally is smitten with him by the end of it. So it was like, just keep your mouth shut, Homer. You were in. You had it. It was done.
No,
she's gonna go.
I agree that he respects her. I mean, she asks, like, why is there makeout music on? It's like, well, I don't study the makeout music. It's like, all right. And he just turns it off.
Right.
And, I thought it was a lovely touch where, he takes the corsage that he had, sad corsage, and he was able to replace her torn dress strap with it. Yeah. It's a lovely moment.
For the end. The end is actually really the way when it finally turns and she picks him up, and the way the episode ends is very sweet, very like heartwarming. You get the lump in the throat if you're in the right mood.
Once you stop this car, I'm gonna hug you and kiss you, and then I'll never be able to let you go. And I never have.
The episode is obviously structured in it's very much a rom-com kind of thing, the rom-com formula. And, with the mismatched couple that ultimately gets together, because ultimately they are good for each other or whatever. So it follows that formula. And because of that sort of mixture of humor, and again, it's James L. Brooks. You feel the James L. Brooks touch in this episode because of that. It could almost be the plot of As Good as It Gets. It has that same sort of rom-com quality to it. But one thing that jumped out at me especially is that the character of Homer, and maybe you can follow my logic, is particularly pathetic. It's an interesting choice that the writers made to make him really pathetic, like really pitiful, you know? And I don't know how I feel about that exactly, but you know what I mean, right?
Well, he's an underachiever, and
Sure.
you know, he's a guy who's not really thinking about, you know, he's not thinking 10 steps ahead here. It's always well intentioned with him, and I think that's a through line we see through the, you know, when we have discord between Homer and Marge, that he is you know, what you see is what you get, and that he's always gonna mean well. He's not going to be deceitful. You know, it's the kind of thing that we see, I think, in other, you know, sitcoms where we typically see the fat guy with the sexy wife, you know, the blue collar husband and the wife, and it, you know, seems to be an intellectual, and we don't understand how could these two get together, and we always kind of come to this conclusion. And you know, you can see that Homer, in his way, you know, really does, you know, like Marge, and you know, the scene where, you know, his heart's broken after prom, and you know, and he's honest about that, is even though he spent way too much going to prom, and when he was supposed to replace the engine in his car. I mean, I myself, I never went to prom. I briefly considered going, but I had a math teacher that I used to talk, like, after class. We used to just chat, and he said, "Yeah, you're probably not. Don't do it. You're not going to like it, and it's going to be a waste of money." Yeah, I never went to my prom. Did you ever go to any type of school dance or prom?
Yeah, a couple of times. The thing is that I finished high school. I graduated from high school here in Bolivia, and I graduated high school from, as I've said in previous episodes, a rather bottom of the barrel high school. So although we had a kind of prom, it was a very kind of modest thing. So yeah, I attended it, but ultimately, you know, as soon as that was over, it was just like my friends and I, like my classmates and I, we kind of made our own prom. You know, we went to someone's house and basically, you know, said, "All right, time to get drunk." That was our prom. We just like, we're in the house. She was great about it too. She was class president, and she was all like, "Yeah, it's at my house. Don't worry, we're gonna get smashed at my house." I was like, "All right, fine, terrific." We all just went there, and it was a blast. So that was our prom. So no, I didn't have a like traditional prom. I had a senior trip, which was cool. You know, we where the whole class, we took a trip to the department of Cochabamba, Bolivia, which people who have any familiarity will know that Cochabamba is where Scarface, in the movie Scarface, that's where Tony Montana goes to meet Sosa. That's where we had our prom, in the beautiful city of Cochabamba, Bolivia. Our senior trip, you know, it was like a 3-day or 4-day trip. It was a lot of fun. And then, you know, the modest party, and then we all got smashed at the class president's house, which was awesome.
I think even these days, you're like, I don't know if you consider this sad, but there are like events that you could do where they'll kind of like reenact the prom. Obviously not right now and under current circumstances, but
sure,
you know, in the past, and eventually it'll come back, where you would pay money and you would basically have that prom-like experience when you're a grown-ass adult.
Yeah, well, let me see if I understand. So it's a bit like a high school reunion kind of thing, except you do it as if it were a prom, or it's just like a prom that you can randomly go to.
It's not a high school event. It
okay.
would be like I once went to this. It was held at the Henry Fonda Theater. It was like a club thing. So like we're gonna do like an '80s prom thing, and we're gonna have '80s music, and we can take photos, and so it was like a dance event. And then there are other so these are like private dance events that are basically set up to be like high school proms that you would pay to go to privately, and it would reenact the prom experience. That's what it is. So it wasn't like the school district isn't doing this. It's just something you could do privately that you could go to.
Well, you asked me a minute ago if I thought that was sad, and it's a little sad. I mean, because the way I see it, it's like, okay, you missed out on the prom, fair enough, and if you regret that, I feel bad. But at the same time, one of the, I think, appeals of the prom is that it's a moment that you're sharing with your classmates. It's a moment that you're sharing with people that you know. I mean, it's a community that you're familiar with. It's the school, and it's sort of like you're saying goodbye to something. It's like it's a farewell. That's the concept. So this is all stuff that you have some kind of a attachment to or some kind of connection to, whether it's your classmates or your school in general or your teachers or whatever it is. But the point is, I don't understand what the appeal would be of just going to like a fake prom with people you don't even know, and you just like walk in there and it's a prom and it's like, oh, Joe Blow from Kokomo is the prom king, and I'm like, the fuck do I care? I don't see the value of it.
Marge, I would appreciate it if you didn't tell anybody about my busy hands. Not so much for myself, but I am so respected, it would damage the town to hear it. Good night.
Now, the note that I'd like to end on here is to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning and try to get your thoughts on why. Like, going back to the fact that this episode aired in 1991, which is 17 years after it takes place. So the characters are reflecting on 17 years in the past, and there is a huge noticeable change. And we were talking about how today that change exists, but it's a lot more subtle. And so I'm wondering why, like, because yeah, it's clear when you said that, oh, you look at something that takes place in 2002, like I'm thinking specifically right now of, let's say, the show Better Call Saul.
Yes.
Okay. Which is quote unquote a period piece, but it takes place like in the I'm not sure. I believe the first episode, the first season takes place in 2002. It's working its way to catch up with the Breaking Bad timeline, which was of its time, and I believe that was 2008 or something like that. So this sort of, it catches up to that. I believe it starts around 2002, 2003, and as it's been moving along, maybe now we're at like 2005 or whatever it is. And again, the only differences you really see are technological. The fact that he's got a flip phone, or whatever, it's not, there's nothing, that's really what it is. Nobody has an iPhone. Smartphones don't exist yet. There's this whole subplot in Better Call Saul, which is about him like scamming people with prepaid phones, which still exists, by the way. So it's not even, it's just that the style of the phone is different.
I would say this, because I thought about that question, and you're right that Better Call Saul takes place in the early to mid 2000s. I remember there was this episode where he comes off of probation and gets his law license, and it explicitly says 2004. I think what happened is that we were living through a period like the latter half of the 20th century, from like the 50s to the 90s, where you had a huge amount of change. But there are periods where you could have several decades, and maybe not everything looks starkly different every decade. I'll give an example. Think about it with Westerns. Think about a Western set in the 1850s versus a Western set in the 1890s. Okay, maybe there'll be a reference to the Civil War, and maybe there'll be some subtle differences about the clothes. But it still basically looks the same. Okay, maybe the train looks a little different. And maybe you can use the telegraph. But otherwise, everyone kind of looks the same. And I think it's just it just so happens that there was a period where the aesthetics changed greatly. And then there's a period where the aesthetics don't change very much. But, the technology changes, and, the way people address each other changes, the way people are recognized. Society does change. It just so happens that maybe the T-shirt you're wearing doesn't look all that wildly different than it did, 20 years ago. I mean, there will always be subtle change. I think what helps knowing that things look distinctly different was that if you looked at footage from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, it all had that grainy quality. The video wasn't very good. The film stock looked different. So everything looked kind of hazy and fuzzy. And you could think, okay, that looks really different. Nowadays, you have everything in HD. So everything looks like it's right now. That's just a thought I had. But I think it just goes to my point that we got used to one way of where the aesthetics were rapidly changing, and now it's not so much.
Obviously, there are things that are of their time. I mean, hipster fashion,
yes,
the skinny jeans, the beard, that's a relatively now thing. It's something of the last decade or so. Whereas, and I'm sure that will eventually become, that's the sort of thing where when they do period pieces about the 2010s, you'll have that, you'll have the hipster fashion all over the place. And people will say, yep, that's very 2010. But there are little things, but they're very subtle. It's not, or maybe they just feel like it because, at least from my perspective, like I'm not with it, like I dress pretty classically, I don't really look at trends. I'm not, I sort of keep things simple, and I always have. Like I've never really been that much into that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I'll see something from 1992. I'll be like, oh, that'll take me right back. The clothes, the way they're dressed, the way, like the music, all that stuff will take you right back. And that just doesn't happen with the 2020s, with the 2010s, because I'm already a man out of time. I'm still listening to stuff from the 80s and 90s. I have no idea what's in now. Like I don't,
For me, I was never with it, so I never had it, but so I never lost it. But I think if anything to help identify those errors, certainly music, as you just said, I think would help, because like you talk about mid 2000s, there's that whole emo thing going on, and then prior to that, new metal. Oof. And then I think there was that annoying, it's called dubstep, that electronic dance music stuff in the early 2010s. So you could have that. But again, as you said, I mean, I'm still, I'm out of time of as much as you are on this stuff. And it's always something that's always kept in the place of like the really young. And
yes, it's of the young. That's true. I mean, not that I feel old or anything, but that doesn't help me in any way either, because it's like my daughter. Okay, so like I can't even look to her to see what the trends are, because unless, hey, maybe I'm wrong, but it's like she just got herself a kind of Joan Jett mullet going, and she put little highlights in her hair, and I'm like, that's, to me, that's 80s. She's right. And so I go like, whoa, okay. I guess for her it's retro fashion, and she's having fun with it.
Shut up! I'm over as far as I can go. All right, I'll walk in the mud.
So this was a great talk, as usual. Had fun revisiting this classic episode of The Simpsons, which definitely holds up. We're already in the quality portion of the uptick is happening. It's definitely happening, and it's fun. So cool. So we'll have fun next time, and it'll be great to have you here again.
Oh, absolutely. I will be here.
All right. You take care.
Take care.
So that's it for this week's installment of The Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, or pretty much anywhere. A brief review might actually help boost the podcast's profile. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends, both virtual and actual, on social media. I'm Erix Antoine. I'll be back next Thursday evening to talk about Homer versus Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, in which Homer gets an illegal cable hookup for the Simpsons household, and of course, a classic little morality play ensues. My good friend Chris Prentice will be here to talk about that. And I hope you'll join us. Until then, stay safe out there and continue observing your biosafety and social distancing protocols, because whether your area is opening up or not, we're not quite through this thing. And we need everyone to do their part, keeping themselves and everyone else healthy. And we'll get through this in due time. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
Never made it as a wise man. I couldn't cut it as a poor man. Shh.